October 25, 1944, just after dawn, the Sibuyan Sea. The horizon is a hard grey line, barely visible through the low mist. Diesel fumes hang over the water. Steel decks sweat under boots that have been packing since before first light. Somewhere off the port bow, a signal lamp blinks, sharp, deliberate. Orders are moving again. From above, the formation is almost beautiful. Warships carve clean lines through the Sibuyan Sea, spaced with mathematical precision. Destroyers screen the outer edge. Cruisers hold disciplined intervals. Heavier ships anchor the center like steel pillars. Every wake runs parallel. Every turn is synchronized. It looks invincible. This is textbook fleet doctrine, decades of training expressed in geometry, overlapping fields of fire, layered defense, mutual protection. If enemy aircraft appear, the guns will answer together. If surface ships approach, broadsides will converge like closing jaws. Perfection means strength. At least that was once true. Below deck, radar operators track distant contacts. Blips move steadily across glowing screens, faint at first, then sharper. Bearings are passed upward, range calculations refined, speed confirmed. The fleet adjusts slightly, not enough to break alignment, only enough to optimize firing arcs. The structure remains intact. On the bridges, commanders feel steady confidence. Formation means control. Control means power. Ships that stay aligned can bring maximum force to bear at the right moment. But something has changed since the doctrine was written. Modern naval gunnery no longer depends on what can be seen. Through American radar scopes miles away, the Japanese formation does not appear as individual ships. It appears as a pattern, a clean, readable structure moving at constant speed. Distance between vessels is consistent. Reaction windows are predictable. Turning arcs are constrained by proximity. In older wars, tight formation complicated targeting. Smoke, distance, and guesswork blurred clarity. Now clarity is mathematical. Fire control systems absorb the geometry instantly. Solutions are solved not ship by ship, but formation by formation. One target is selected. Others are already plotted relative to it. Range corrections cascade automatically through the line. When the first salvos come, they are not random. They are calculated. Shells fall with unnerving precision. A cruiser near the outer screen shudders under impact. Seconds later, another vessel further inside the formation takes a hit adjusted from the first solution. The pattern holds, so does the targeting. The Japanese ships attempt to maneuver. But maneuver inside perfection requires coordination. A sharp turn risks collision. A sudden break disrupts firing lanes. Commands are issued carefully, deliberately, because discipline has always meant survival. Today, discipline costs time. And time, measured in seconds, is now the currency of destruction. The formation remains beautiful. But through radar, it is no longer beautiful. It is readable. And readable things, in modern naval warfare, do not last long. Inside the American plotting rooms, the battle did not look dramatic. It looked clean. Radar scopes showed the Japanese formation as ordered echoes, bright returns arranged in a near-perfect grid. Range rings expanded outward in precise increments. Bearings updated smoothly. There was no confusion about spacing, no ambiguity about alignment. The formation solved itself. Fire control teams no longer needed to isolate ships visually through smoke or distance. They did not wait for gun flashes to confirm identity. Radar delivered position, course, and speed continuously. That data flowed directly into mechanical calculators that predicted where each ship would be seconds later. Not where it was, where it would be. Tight formation made those predictions easier. When ships maintain disciplined intervals, they limit sudden movement. Turning arcs are constrained by neighboring hulls. Acceleration must be gradual to avoid collision. Reaction becomes coordinated rather than instinctive. From a radar perspective, Coordination equals predictability. The first American salvos were not exploratory. They were solutions. A cruiser on the outer edge absorbed the initial correction. Observers noted splash patterns instantly through radar return distortions. Adjustment was minimal. Within seconds, subsequent batteries shifted aim, not randomly, but relative to the first data point. Because the formation held steady, everything connected. Destroyers screening the perimeter attempted evasive maneuvers, but their options were limited. A hard turn inward risked crossing friendly fire lanes. A break outward exposed them to isolation. Every choice required confirmation from the rest of the line. That confirmation took time. American guns did not. The geometry began to work against the Japanese fleet. When one vessel altered course, its movement constrained those beside it. Slight hesitation rippled outward through the structure. Ships adjusted carefully, unwilling to collapse the formation that defined their strength. But radar punished careful movement. Each coordinated shift simply refreshed the firing solution. Instead of breaking pattern, the fleet reinforced it. Instead of scattering unpredictably, it preserved order long enough for that order to be targeted systematically. The illusion of control remained visible on deck. Signals flashed, engines responded, commands were obeyed. But the tempo had shifted. American radar shortened the cycle between detection and correction to seconds. Japanese command cycles, built around visibility, signal interpretation, and disciplined maneuver, operated on longer rhythms. Those rhythms no longer matched the speed of incoming fire. Another impact struck deeper within the formation, then another, slightly aft. Damage control teams rushed to contain fires, but fires inside tight alignment created new hazards. Smoke drifted across adjacent decks. Debris interfered with neighboring guns. The structure was still intact, but now it was absorbing damage as a system. The Japanese fleet had formed perfectly to maximize collective power. Modern gunnery turned that collective power into collective vulnerability. Through radar, the formation was not a symbol of strength. It was a solved equation. And once an equation is solved in war, the outcome follows quickly. The first instinct was to hold formation. That was what doctrine demanded. A fleet under fire did not scatter blindly. It tightened discipline. It reinforced structure. Ships maintained intervals so their guns could continue to operate in coordinated arcs. Cohesion meant survival. For a few crucial minutes, that instinct held. Signals flashed across the water. Engines adjusted incrementally. Damage control teams moved below deck with controlled urgency. Smoke rose from struck vessels, but the alignment remained largely intact. It still looked like a fleet. Then the third major hit changed the tone. A cruiser near the center of the formation absorbed a direct strike that ignited secondary fires. Speed dropped. The ship began to lag slightly, only a few knots at first, but enough to disrupt spacing. The vessels astern were forced to compensate, adjusting course carefully to avoid collision. That careful adjustment exposed them. American radar did not hesitate. The moment the formation shifted unevenly, the distortion became a new reference point. Updated solutions were calculated in seconds. Salvos shifted accordingly. Another impact. Then another. On Japanese bridges, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The enemy fire was not random. It was tracking movement. Every adjustment seemed to invite a correction. Every attempt to preserve order simply refreshed the accuracy of incoming rounds. The realization was slow but devastating. Formation was no longer protection. It was constraint. Breaking formation meant abandoning years of drilled coordination. It meant sacrificing mutual protection for individual survival. It meant admitting that the structure itself was now the problem. But staying aligned meant continuing to absorb precision fire. Commanders faced a decision few had ever trained for: destroy the doctrine or let the doctrine destroy them. Some captains began making independent adjustments, harder turns, sharper accelerations, risking temporary confusion to disrupt the pattern, but not all ships could respond equally. Damaged vessels could not maneuver aggressively. Larger ships required space they did not have. The fleet began to fracture unevenly. And uneven fracture was even easier to target. Radar thrived on contrast. Ships accelerating sharply stood out. Ships lagging behind created clear gaps. The once perfect geometry dissolved into partial shapes that were still readable, just less symmetrical. The American fire control advantage remained intact. On Japanese decks, discipline did not collapse, but certainty did. The belief that alignment maximized strength was being tested in real time by mathematics the crews could not see. The fleet was still powerful, its guns still fired, its crews still fought with resolve. But it was fighting the last war's geometry in the current war's physics. Perfection had carried them into engagement. Now perfection was preventing escape. And the longer it took to fully abandon it, the more ships paid the price for holding onto it. The order to break formation did not come as a shout. It came as a realization. By the time senior commanders accepted that alignment was amplifying vulnerability, several ships were already burning. Damage control crews were stretched thin. Smoke blurred visibility not just for the enemy, but for friendly coordination as well. The fleet began to turn, not together but apart. Destroyers peeled outward in sharper arcs, trying to widen spacing. Cruisers increased speed independently. Larger ships struggled to pivot cleanly, their turning circles vast compared to the tightening battle space. For a moment, it looked like freedom. But breaking formation mid-engagement created its own dangers. Ships crossing wake lines disrupted firing lanes. Friendly gunners lost clean arcs. Signals lagged behind action. Some vessels accelerated into temporary isolation, exposing themselves to concentrated fire before support could realign. Radar did not care whether the fleet was aligned or fractured. It adapted instantly. Instead of solving one large geometric pattern, American fire control systems now solved several smaller ones. Independent ships became individual targets. A vessel accelerating hard created a bright, distinct track. A damaged ship falling behind became an isolated solution with minimal interference. The tempo did not slow. If anything, it accelerated. Without the stabilizing discipline of formation, Japanese ships maneuvered more aggressively, but aggression without synchronization bred chaos. One destroyer cut across a cruiser's wake to avoid collision. Another slowed unexpectedly after near misses disrupted steering. A battleship's turn masked a neighboring vessel's line of fire. Moments like these were measured in seconds. And seconds in this engagement were lethal. The fleet's structure dissolved fully into survival patterns. Ships no longer acted as components of a single organism. They fought as individuals sharing the same water, but not the same geometry. The psychological shift was immense. Formation had been confidence made visible. Breaking it felt like admitting the enemy had already outpaced them. Even as crews fought with discipline, the mental anchor of structure was gone. The WWII was no longer filled with orderly lines of steel. It was filled with maneuvering silhouettes trying to outpace mathematics. But radar did not tire, it did not panic, it did not hesitate when doctrine changed, it simply recalculated. Another ship took a hit amidships. Another slowed. Another trailed smoke as engines faltered. Breaking formation had been necessary. It just wasn't enough. The fleet had formed perfectly. Then it had fractured urgently. But in a war governed by detection speed and fire control precision, both perfection and fracture were equally visible. And visibility more than courage or firepower, was now deciding the outcome. The sea was still grey, the mist still low. But what had begun as beautiful geometry had become something else entirely. A lesson written in steel and timing, about how modern war punished order just as quickly as disorder. Even as formation dissolved, Japanese guns continued to fire. Broadside after broadside roared across the water. Shell splashes climbed high around American ships. Anti-aircraft batteries stood ready for threats above. Crews did everything doctrine demanded, everything training had drilled into them. Courage was not lacking, but courage could not slow mathematics. American radar systems were no longer solving a formation. They were solving tempo. Every Japanese ship now maneuvered independently, but their movements still followed constraints, speed limits, turning radii, damage effects. The data never stopped updating. Where one vessel lost speed due to flooding, radar noticed. Where another accelerated to clear smoke, radar recalculated. Fire control solutions cascaded from ship to ship with mechanical efficiency. The Japanese fleet was still powerful. It was simply reacting. And reaction in late-war naval combat meant delay. A heavy cruiser attempted a sharp evasive maneuver after near-miss splashes bracketed its bow. The turn was clean, disciplined. For a moment, it appeared to break the pattern. Then a corrected salvo landed aft. Not because the maneuver failed, because the correction cycle was faster. On bridges across the fleet, commanders began to recognize a deeper truth. It was not just that American gunnery was accurate. It was that accuracy was being sustained without degradation. Smoke did not blind it. Distance did not reduce it. Maneuver did not confuse it for long. Radar had replaced sight. And sight had once been the equalizer. Now visibility no longer determined who could aim. Information did. The Salvos Sea turned into a series of isolated crises. Fires broke out in compartments already weakened. Damage control teams fought flooding while new impacts shook bulkheads. Communications strained under overlapping reports. But even in chaos, one fact stood out. The Japanese fleet could not regain initiative. Every decision came after incoming fire, not before it. Every maneuver responded to impact, not anticipation. The tempo was being dictated externally. The formation had been designed to maximize collective strength. The brake had been intended to restore flexibility. Neither had restored control. As another vessel slowed, listing under accumulating damage, the pattern became unmistakable. The fleet was no longer fighting for positional advantage. It was fighting for survival. And survival, under continuous radar-directed fire, was a narrowing path. From above, the once beautiful geometry had become scattered wakes and drifting smoke columns. Ships no longer carved perfect lines. They left interrupted paths, some straight, some erratic, some fading entirely. The sea that had held symmetry now held consequence. The Japanese fleet had formed perfectly to concentrate firepower. Modern naval warfare had turned that perfection into predictability, and predictability into vulnerability. By the time the lesson was fully understood, it was no longer theoretical. It was burning on the water, and no amount of discipline could reverse what radar had already made inevitable. By mid-engagement, something subtle but decisive had happened. The Japanese fleet was no longer making choices. It was making adjustments. That difference defined the rest of the battle. Every order issued now responded to damage already sustained. Speed changes followed impacts. Course corrections followed incoming salvos. Even aggressive maneuvers felt defensive, attempts to reduce exposure rather than shape the fight. Meanwhile, American radar continued its quiet work. Tracking did not falter, fire control did not hesitate, solutions were recalculated continuously unaffected by smoke or shifting light. The technology did not tire, it did not doubt. It simply updated. The Japanese commanders began to feel it, not as panic, but as narrowing space. There was no clear maneuver left that restored advantage. Breaking formation had not solved the targeting problem. Tightening formation again would only recreate it. The fleet was trapped between two versions of vulnerability. A battleship slowed under accumulating damage, and that slowing created a new center of gravity. Other ships adjusted instinctively to protect it. Radar noticed the clustering instantly. Fire shifted accordingly. Another ship shuddered under impact. The pattern repeated. What had begun as an engagement between fleets was now a progression of controlled reductions. Ships were not being destroyed all at once. They were being degraded systematically. And systematic degradation has a psychological weight. On Japanese bridges, officers could see the fight slipping beyond their influence. Guns still fired, commands still flowed, but the rhythm was wrong. They were always one step behind. Initiative, the invisible currency of battle, had shifted fully, and once lost in a radar-guided fight, it was nearly impossible to reclaim. The Salvos Sea no longer held a contest of formations. It held a demonstration. Perfection in alignment had made the fleet readable. Breaking that alignment had not erased the data. The enemy had already solved the geometry. Now it was simply executing. And execution, once sustained, rarely reverses itself. What made the engagement especially unforgiving was not just the accuracy of fire, but the persistence of pattern. Even fractured, the fleet carried habits of structure. Ships maintained approximate intervals out of instinct. Commanders avoided chaotic crossings. Years of training could not be abandoned instantly. Those instincts, once strengths, now acted as anchors. A destroyer attempted a sharp evasive turn, but moderated it to avoid obstructing a cruiser's firing line. Seconds later, a corrected salvo landed precisely where that moderation had left it exposed. A cruiser accelerated to break isolation, but stayed within signaling distance of larger vessels. Radar adjusted for the new speed and maintained solution. Each attempt at disciplined maneuver preserved just enough predictability to remain targetable. It was not incompetence. It was inertia. Doctrine had shaped behavior so deeply that abandoning it fully felt reckless, even when the doctrine itself was failing. That hesitation was measurable in seconds, and in 1944, seconds determined survival. American gunnery did not need overwhelming volume. It needed continuity. And continuity was never broken. The sea filled with smoke columns marking ships that were still afloat but no longer fully effective. Damage control efforts became triage. Protection became secondary to containment. The fleet that had formed to maximize firepower now fought to preserve mobility. The geometry that once symbolized strength had become a visible liability. Not because it was poorly executed, but because it was perfectly executed in the wrong era. As the battle wore on, the mist that had framed the morning returned in patches, drifting low across the water. Through it, damaged ships moved slowly, some under escort, others barely responsive. The visual scene was chaotic. The radar picture was not. This was the quiet revolution of late-war naval combat. Battles were no longer decided by who could see better through smoke or maneuver more elegantly in formation. They were decided by who could process information faster and convert it into fire. The Japanese fleet had done everything correctly by the standards of an earlier age. It had formed precisely. It had maneuvered with discipline. It had maintained cohesion under pressure. Those virtues were real. They were simply insufficient. Modern naval gunnery had transformed predictability into exposure. Clean lines became targeting references. Coordinated turns became solution updates. Even bravery became part of a dataset once it translated into measurable movement. The Salvos Sea did not witness a failure of seamanship. It witnessed a shift in physics. And physics does not negotiate with tradition. By the time the firing lessened, the outcome was already clear. Ships still floated, crews still fought, but the fleet no longer possessed the structural advantage it had entered with. The engagement had demonstrated something irreversible. Perfect formation maximized firepower, but it also maximized readability. In an era defined by radar-directed guns, readability was fatal. The fleet had organized itself into clarity, and clarity shortened the enemy's decision cycle. The tragedy was not that the formation failed. It was that it succeeded exactly as designed. And in succeeding, it exposed the fleet to a form of warfare that did not reward symmetry. The Japanese fleet formed perfectly that morning. Lines were clean, intervals exact, doctrine honored. It was everything a traditional navy aspired to be. But modern naval combat no longer rewarded perfection in alignment. It rewarded disruption, unpredictability, dispersion, anything that complicated data. By forming flawlessly, the fleet simplified the problem for its enemy. Radar did not fear symmetry. It solved it. The Salvos Sea became a lesson written in mist and steel. In the age of modern fire control, beauty on the water could become vulnerability beneath it. Perfection had once been strength. Now it was exposure. And exposure, once detected, rarely survives long enough to correct itself.